Hello everything. Shanice never imagined that the thing she feared most would not come from an outsider, but from her own blood. The secret she tried to bury was not just a mistake or an old wound. It was the part of her past she had paid dearly to leave behind so she could move forward. She believed that if she lived sincerely enough and loved deeply enough, Ted would eventually see who she was in the present instead of judging her for what had happened before. But just as Shanice began to believe she might truly deserve happiness, her sister quietly turned that hope into something to be destroyed. She was not acting out of justice, nor was she truly trying to protect Ted the way she claimed. Beneath all of that cold concern and controlled urgency was a deep and simmering jealousy, a bitterness that had grown from always standing behind Shanice, always watching her younger sister receive the love, attention, and validation she secretly craved for herself. Ted became the symbol of everything she believed had been taken from her: recognition, love, and the feeling of being chosen. That was why exposing Shanice's secret was never an impulsive act. It was a carefully calculated plan, built step by step, sharp enough to create suspicion and cruel enough to leave Shanice with no way to defend herself. Everything became even more dangerous when Monas refused to object. Her silence was not loud or dramatic, but it created a sense of betrayal even more painful than an open accusation. Monas had always been the one person Shanice believed she could lean on when her family life became suffocating. The one place where she thought she would still be understood. But the moment she realized her aunt was no longer truly on her side, Shanice understood that betrayal inside a family rarely begins with a violent blow. It begins with averted eyes, half-hearted advice, and moments when people choose silence in the face of injustice because it serves their private calculations. Monas may not have wanted to destroy Shanice outright, but she had allowed herself to be persuaded by the idea that Shanice no longer deserved Ted. That a secret this serious had to come out sooner or later, and that if everything fell apart, then perhaps it was only the inevitable consequence of what Shanice had hidden. She told herself this so she would not have to feel guilty, but that very justification turned her into a dangerous part of the scheme. She did not need to strike directly. All she had to do was provide a few details, confirm a few suspicions, or simply let Shanice's sister know when the perfect moment had arrived to deliver the most devastating blow. In Shanice's eyes, that was no longer indifference. It was betrayal through complicity. Ted found himself trapped in the middle of that storm, torn away from his own instincts. He loved Shanice not because she was flawless, but because being with her had once made life feel calmer, more honest, less artificial. But love becomes fragile when suspicion takes root, and once the pieces of Shanice's secret were exposed in the cruelest possible way, Ted began looking at her through a different lens. What hurt him most was not only the content of the secret itself, but the feeling that he had been shut out from one of the most important truths in her life. He began to question whether everything Shanice had given him had been real, or whether it had all been a carefully edited version of herself, stripped of anything that might have made him walk away. That wound made Ted vulnerable to Shanice's sister, who always appeared at exactly the right moment, wearing a mask of calm maturity and tender understanding. She never had to openly fight for him, She only had to become the one who listened, the one who stayed close when his anger was at its peak, the one who gently planted the idea that Shanice had not only hidden the truth, but had never truly been brave enough to love him honestly. The most effective manipulation is the kind that makes the victim believe the conclusion was their own. And Shanice's sister understood that better than anyone. As for Shanice, the deepest pain did not come from the secret being exposed, but from losing all control over how her story was being told. She was turned into the villain in a drama written by other people, where every silence was treated as proof of deceit and every attempt to hold on was seen as a weak excuse. The more she tried to explain, the more guilty she appeared. The more she suffered, the more unstable she seemed, and that loss of control only pushed Ted farther away. The anger she had buried for so long began to change her. She no longer wanted only to save her relationship. She wanted the people who had pushed her to the edge to pay for what they had done. From a woman who had once kept quiet to prevent her family from breaking apart, Shanice slowly became someone willing to expose every remaining secret, including the ones that could destroy both Monas and her sister. She realized that if she had already been turned into the guilty one, then continuing to protect the dignity of the people who betrayed her was simply another way of destroying herself. That thought made Shanice more dangerous, colder, and harder than she had ever been before. For the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid of losing everything. Her sister, after successfully setting the trap in motion, no longer had any way back either. What had begun as jealousy had now become an obsession with winning at any cost. She could not bear the possibility that Ted might still love Shanice, might still want to forgive her, might still be drawn back to her despite everything he had learned. So she pushed further, not only twisting the past, but also creating situations that made Shanice look unstable and potentially dangerous to everyone around her. Her cruelty did not explode in public. It moved quietly through small but carefully targeted acts, a piece of information sent at just the right moment, a meeting arranged to create misunderstanding, an old piece of evidence dragged out and reframed in a darker context. She convinced herself that this was the only way to secure happiness, but the farther she went, the more one horrifying truth emerged. Ted was not even the real prize. What she truly wanted was the satisfaction of defeating Shanice, of watching her younger sister collapse under the weight of humiliation and loss. Ted was only the reward attached to a bitterness that had been building for years. Shanice had always been the real target. Eventually, Monas had to face the consequences of her silence. Once the family began to fracture beyond repair, once Ted grew cold, Shanice nearly severed all trust, and Shanice's sister allowed her ambitions to become more and more shameless. Monas realized she had lost control of the very thing she had quietly allowed to happen. She had once told herself that it would stop with the truth coming out, that after the anger settled, right and wrong would become clear on their own. But the truth did not save this family. The way it was used was what destroyed everything. Monas began to understand that she was no longer just an observer. She had become part of the collapse itself. That guilt came too late, because in Shanice's eyes, her aunt was no longer family. She was simply another adult who had stood by and watched her be pushed toward the edge. Wounds inflicted by outsiders can sometimes heal, but wounds caused by betrayal within a family often leave behind a far deeper emptiness. Ted was finally forced to confront the most brutal question of all. Did he love the real woman in front of him? Or did he love the sense of safety he once had before he knew the full truth? The deeper he sank into the chaos, the more he realized that nothing was as simple as right and wrong. Shanice had secrets, but not every secret is born from betrayal. Her sister seemed honest, but not every truth is spoken out of kindness. Ted slowly realized that he had been led by his own pain, that his anger had made him cling too easily to anyone who allowed him to feel like the victim. But that awakening came with an even greater loss. The trust between him and Shanice had shattered in a way that could never be fully repaired. Even if he recognized who had truly loved him, he also had to accept that some realizations come too late, and some wounds cannot be stitched closed with regret. By then, this was no longer a simple love triangle. It had become a tragedy about jealousy, control, and the cost of turning love into a battlefield. Shanice did not just lose Ted. She lost the illusion that family would always be the last place he could return to. Ted did not just lose trust in the woman he loved. He lost trust in his own judgment. Manas lost the right to be seen as a source of comfort, while Shanice's sister, even if she managed to get what she wanted, would eventually discover the bitter truth that love won through manipulation is nothing more than a hollow shadow of victory. And that is what makes everything even more violent moving forward. Because once each of them is carrying pain, anger, and the feeling of being robbed, they will not stop after hurting one another once. They will keep reacting, keep sinking deeper, and keep forcing one another into darker choices until none of them can even remember where this tragedy truly began.